Well, thanks for joining me. I'm Gary Zacharias, and this is the Apologist Bookshelf. I want to look at Craig Blomberg's book called The Historical Reliability of the Gospels. We did a previous podcast on that. I thought it might be interesting to take his chapter on, if I can get the start of it here, it's chapter 3, and it's called Miracles. And he he starts off really effectively. I think he says, 6 large jars of water suddenly appear filled with wine. A man walks across a lake, apparently defying the law of gravity. 5,000 men, plus who knows how many women and children, satisfy their hunger from a quantity of food, originally numbering 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and they finish with enough leftovers to fill 12 baskets. He says this is a part of the world of the miracles of Jesus that we hear about in the New Testament. So that's a hard sell these days, isn't it? He says, who today could believe such stories? He said there's an intuitive sense in which even people who are devout believers, they can kind of sense that gut level feeling that the skeptic has. You're going, really? This happened? Do you really believe that? How could that happen today? We're in such a scientific age. Isn't that all just made up stuff? And he said basically there are 3 reasons to reject the gospel miracles. So he tackles each one of these 3. So here they are. There's the scientific reason to doubt miracles. There's the philosophical reason, and then historical objections. So we'll see how far we get today. It's a good-sized chapter and a lot of meaty material in there, so we may not get it all done, which is okay. We could do it in the next podcast as well. So he starts off with the scientific objections. He says, we're now mastering the world so much through science and technology that who in the world is going to seriously hold the New Testament view of the world? So now the idea is that we have a modern conception of the human race and science and what it's been able to do, and there's a big objection to miracles that we've discovered all these laws, and so miracles are impossible. But he said, what's interesting is that many scientists today wouldn't feel that was that great an objection like they might have earlier in the century. Why? Well, physical science has undergone all sorts of revolutions, and this whole idea of Newtonian mechanics, the laws of Newtonian mechanics, clockwork world where you just wind everything up and everything goes according to plan, tick-tock, tick-tock, like a clock. But he said, what have we got today instead? The last 30, 40 years, it's shaken up everything. You've got Heisenberg, the principle of indeterminacy. What's going on there? Well, physicists don't know at the same time both the position and the momentum, for example, of a subatomic particle. So they can't rule out any kind of given configuration of particles. So Heisenberg's principle of indeterminacy says we don't know as much as we thought we knew. We're a little fuzzy on this kind of stuff. And so this is most defenders of miracles today don't deny that nature is regular, yeah. But what they deny, in other words, the Christian perspective, the Judeo-Christian view, is that a miracle is not necessarily a violation of the law. Why couldn't God, for example, suspend or transcend the otherwise fixed regularities of nature? So you don't need a new physical principle to be violated if there's another new causal agent that's introduced. I always like the picture, and it's not in his book here, but I like the idea that if you have a vase on a shelf and somebody accidentally kind of hits it with the elbow or something and it goes heading toward the floor, if nothing else happens, because of gravity, it's going to hit the floor, and because of the momentum and all sorts of laws, it's going to break apart probably and shatter. But what if somebody who knocked it over reacts in time and grabs it as it's halfway to the floor? Now, did that person violate gravity? No. It's not a violation. It's a new causal agent that is introduced. The hand comes in, grabs the vase, and keeps it from crashing to the floor. So miracles follow logically, actually, Blomberg says, if theism is true, but not if deism or atheism is true. So he likes the William Lane Craig approach, who has a pretty well-known argument by now. Number 1, everything that begins to exist has to have a cause for its existence. Number 2, the universe began to exist, so number 3, the universe has a cause for its existence. And that could be personal because there was a choice to create it. So I think that's interesting. Now, in fact, at the end of that section here, he's talking about the scientific objections. He says in some circles there are physicists that are actually more willing to believe in miracles than biblical scholars. And so the notion that science has proven the supernatural impossible has to be tossed out, he says. Now, it's not just him. He's quoting from other people as well. So there was the first objection, scientific objection. What about the philosophical objection? Well, guess who we go to? Blomberg says, go to David Hume. And Hume claims that the probability for a natural event is always going to be greater than for a supernatural explanation. Now, to substantiate that, he says 4 main reasons. Number 1, no alleged miracle has ever been supported with enough number of witnesses. Might have been a deception, might have been something going on there. So he says there's a problem. Number 2, Hume says people in general crave the miraculous, and they're going to believe these things more than they really should. Third reason, Hume says the probability for a natural event is always going to be greater than supernatural. He says miracles only occur among barbarous people. And then number 4, miracle stories are in all religions, and they cancel each other out because they're irreconcilable as far as the doctrines. So now Blomberg takes on those claims. He says, number 1, the claim that no alleged miracle has ever been supported with the testimony of enough witnesses. He says, well, even if that's true, that doesn't prove that no miracle will ever have adequate testimony. He said, actually, you can make a pretty good case for saying that the witnesses of the gospel miracles do offer adequate testimony. Then he takes a look at Hume's second claim. People in general crave the miraculous, so they're more gullible. He said that's probably true. But he said all that means is that you just have to look at these testimonies about miracle claims. You've got to look at it with a lot of caution and a lot of suspicion. Then he tackles the third of Hume's claims. Hume says miracles only occur among barbarous people. He said that's demonstrably false. Number 4, miracle stories occur in all religions. They cancel each other out. He says no. And he says no religion stands or falls with a claim about the resurrection of its founder the way Christianity does. It's very different than the other religions. Now, he says Hume actually went further. So Hume says that the weight of probability would still favor a non-miraculous explanation just because that's the way we explain everything else in the world. So it's the uniform testimony of human experience. That's against admitting the miraculous. But Blomberg says that tries to prove too much. He says if historians applied that to their examination of human testimony, they'd rule out everything unique that's ever occurred, including things that are not really considered miraculous. It says even back in the 1800s, there's an author that said, well, what if we study the life of Napoleon? That was unique in a lot of ways. And so, you wouldn't believe Napoleon was possible if you had that. So he's just saying this philosophical objection really falls apart. And I've heard the same thing, that Hume is not really considered to have a knockdown, flat-out argument that gets rid of miracles. Here's the third thing that he says. He calls them the historical objections. He talks about a German historian who said that no historian should accept an account of a past event for which he doesn't have an analogy in the present, like the raising of a dead person. But he said, there are a couple of ways to reply. One is to deny the validity of the principle, and the other is to deny that no one today experiences miracles. He said both of these would be good approaches. He says, to begin with the second one, he says it's really hard to claim miracles only occurred in Bible times. In fact, I would suggest, and again, Blomberg didn't put this in because the book hadn't been available yet, but there's a book just called Miracles. Peter Kreeft has it, and it's full of great miracle stories, things going on nowadays. There's a book called Signs and Miracles in America Today. Same thing, lots of stories of modern-day miracles. He said there's a growing awareness, I'm back to Blomberg now, a growing awareness that much of what we have in our world today is paranormal. There are a lot of uncanny events that can't be explained by natural causes that we know about. It says, actually, as in the Bible, not all the supernatural things that we hear about are good actions. There's a notion of a demonic realm as well. And he actually then says that first point seems equally questionable, the point that history has no right to accept as historical something of a past event, that there's no analogy in the present. says it's not back to Blomberg, it's not the lack of analogy that suggests something is unhistorical, but only the presence of an analogy to something already known to be unhistorical. So what does he mean? Well, he says, well, what about this? The reason many people, including Christians, who believe in biblical miracles, they dismiss most UFO sightings is not because they have been proven not to exist, but because the sightings usually resemble other ones that have turned out to be hot air balloons or northern lights or shooting stars. So he said the same logic should be applied to the gospel miracles. So at this point, Blomberg moves along to other questions that have been raised regarding miracles. What about Jesus? Okay, he did some miracles, but didn't other people of that time period have miracles? Different gods and goddesses and historical figures. Isn't Jesus is just one of many? The idea of parallels. And so skeptics will say, well, the early church just had Jesus one of many who had all these miracles. And they point to other books in even apocryphal stories, and they go to Greek religions and mythology and the first century world of magic and sorcery, and on to say, well, see, Jesus was just one of a whole bunch. They just wrapped him up with all the others. But he says, well, what about the New Testament Apocrypha? He said there are all sorts of legends that grew up around the stories of Jesus as a baby and his childhood and the ministry of the apostles. And he said, see, that's just the miracles that Jesus did. That's kind of the same thing. But he said, but you got to look at these apocryphal miracles. He said they differ so much from the canonical gospel. It's hard to believe the same processes led to the formation of them. The Apocrypha seems to have a God who just works miracles on demand and compels people to believe in Christianity. And the wonders that are worked, it's for vengeful reasons or trivial reasons or heretical reasons. And it says they always I deal with the gaps in the New Testament, trying to plug in the stories. He said they were not accurate at all. Nobody really buys into them today. What about Greek stories, Greek mythology? We get all sorts of stories, Blomberg says, that tell about gods and men performing miracles. You got Alexander the Great, Asclepius, Dionysus, Apollonius. He was a wandering first century philosopher. And he supposedly did healings and predicted the future and exorcised demons. He appeared to his followers after he died and he ascended bodily into heaven. Whoa, maybe Jesus is just part of that. Well, that's what his philosopher, Philostratus, who was writing in the 3rd century, had to say. So people says, oh, really? But so the miracles that we hear about in these Greek religions bear very little, in fact, no resemblance to those of Jesus. What about Alexander the Great? No, nothing miraculous there. How about the case of Asclepius? Well, a lot of people don't even believe he existed as a real person. How about Dionysus? He was an imported god of Eastern mythology. What about Apollonius? They said, well, Philostratus only came up with his story about Apollonius after Jesus' life. So who stole what? Well, it wasn't the Jesus followers that stole from Greek ideas. It was the Greeks, in this case Philostratus, who stole from the story of Jesus. And these stories are very independent from each other. So, summing it up, he says in this section, there's no clear stereotype of a divine man earlier than the 2nd century A.D. So the stories that we hear about Jesus came first, and then different religions latched onto those and ran with them themselves. So I think that was interesting. What about magic and exorcism? There's all this magic going on in the 1st century. So some scholars say, well, Jesus' miracles, especially exorcisms, that just hooked into the ancient practices of magic. Some people have said maybe the miracles were because of demons and exorcisms and things like that. Some kind of connection with ancient practices of magic. Okay, well, it said modern scholarship. Some people have claimed that the miracles of Jesus involved demons and magic practices and things like that, because the Jewish leaders we see in Mark 3, some of them attributed Jesus' power to cast out demons as some kind of alliance that he had with the prince of the demons, Beelzebub. So there's that. But it said, if you look at I think it's Matthew 17, says that's the only place in the Gospels where references to disease and demon possession appear in the same passage. So they said probably in this solitary instance, the possession was causing the sickness. And then Blomberg points out that for most of us today in the West, well, especially traditional Christians, not maybe the charismatic ones, but for most of us today, the danger is not that we see all sickness as demonic, but that we don't see any of it that way. And I said, he makes a point here that contemporary experience is making it a lot more difficult to deny that there is demon possession in Western society today. He said, if you really look at factual accounts of the practice and the results of occult and satanic rituals in our society, we think of as very rationalistic and technological. He said we should not dismiss demon and demonic possession as some kind of invention of primitive people. I said the features found elsewhere in old accounts of exorcism that are in the Gospels, things like trying to find out the demon's name to get mastery over him, the use of touch or laying on of hands, the application of spittle. But he said, overall the differences are way more than the similarities between other ancient exorcisms and what Jesus did. So, for example, the idea of discovering the demon's name, it only occurs once in the 4 main exorcisms that Mark recounts. And B and C, the things about laying on of hands or the application of spittle, don't occur in exorcisms, only in healings. When Jesus does touch people, he makes it clear it's their faith and not some kind of magic that saves them. Jesus doesn't use any elaborate spells or incantations. He doesn't do nonsense syllables. He doesn't alter the tone of his voice. He doesn't appeal to any authority outside of himself. And biggest of all, I guess, is that, according to Blomberg, there are no magic objects that appear, in contrast to other ancient descriptions of magic, things like incense and rings and amulets and ashes and dog hair and all this sort of stuff. So it's very, very different. Okay, this is a long chapter. I think what I'll do is break right here. So the whole chapter is really split into 2 sections. I only had time today to do the first section. And that was, there are 2 sets of questions that Blomberg wants to take on. And first was, are there really parallels to the miracles of Jesus in the Mediterranean world of his day? And how significant are the parallels? In other words, is Jesus one of many other miracle workers of this time? And then the second question is, well, what's the evidence for the reliability of the gospel miracle stories? I mean, that's huge, isn't it? Just because it reports miracles, do we have any evidence? And how strong is that evidence? So that's what I'm looking forward to doing in the next podcast. So for this one, it was just, what kind of miracles are there? How many parallels? Does it parallel things like in the New Testament Apocrypha? We covered that. Do the stories of Jesus and his miracles, do they echo Greek heroes and Greek characters? We covered that. What about magic and exorcism? Did what Jesus did tie into the magic and exorcism of that time period? And the answer is no, not really. So that's it for this podcast. I hope it wasn't too detailed. It's from a book called The Historical Reliability of the Gospels. Not an easy read, I would say, but I think it's really important. And I hope you have a chance to take a look at some of Craig Blomberg's work. He does an excellent job. And this is an older book. Let me get the date of it again. 1987. So we're talking 36, 37 years old. That's okay. He's dealing with things that have been around a long time. It's not out of date at all. And you probably find it used really cheap someplace. So a book to consider, The Historical Reliability of the Gospels. All right, well, thanks. And maybe what I'll do is the other half in the next podcast, just so we don't lose sight of the big picture in this. All right, thanks. See you later.